Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Brexit, the crucial question of what next for UK shipping. I'm Helen Kelly, Europe Editor-in-Chief at Lloyd's List. At the end of the presentations, I will be putting your questions to the panelists. Ask these via the online tool on your screen at any time throughout the discussion. So just a quick recap. On June 24, we woke up to the fact that Britain had voted to leave the European Union. We all know what a shambles British politics has since become, but what will happen to UK shipping? Lloyd's List subscribers would have already seen that pundits and experts alike have been laying out their views of what it could mean. Today, we will hear from three of the best placed people to offer insight into what's going on and what might happen. Guy Platten is Chief Executive of the UK Chamber of Shipping. He is a Master Mariner and has held various senior positions across the UK shipping industry. Scott Farley is Head of Communications at the International Underwriting Association. It represents non-Lloyd's insurance and reinsurance companies operating in the London market. Harry Theochari is Global Head of Transport at Norton Fulbright. He is a shipping and asset finance lawyer based in London and has been involved in some of the most innovative ship finance structures of recent years. Just another reminder to use the Q&A button on your screens as we go through the presentations. We start with Guy Platten, who will tell us more about the UK Chamber's strategy for post-Brexit Britain. Guy.
Thanks, Helen, and hello everyone, and thank you to Lloyd's List for offering me the opportunity to speak on this webinar. To start, clearly there is uncertainty across the industry, and the exact nature of the UK's future trading relationships with the EU and the world beyond are currently unclear. What is clear, however, is that huge volumes of trade between the UK and elsewhere in the world have taken place for many years, often without trade deals. Future free trade deals outside of the EU have the capacity to enhance, not merely protect, the UK's trade with the world beyond Europe. Given, though, that the UK's trading relationships have essentially been run by the EU for many years, the UK has a severe shortage of trade negotiators. That's why we have called for a free trade commission, run between the Department for Business and the Foreign Office, to recruit and train an army of trade experts, be they brought in from the private sector or hired from within government civil service. And I was pleased to hear yesterday that KPMG, EY, McKinsey and others have already been approached. Without that expertise and knowledge, the UK will be unable to competently negotiate quality trade deals. But what is clear is that we were a great maritime nation before the vote, and we will be a great maritime nation for a long time to come. If you assess where our status as a great maritime nation comes from, in reality, little of it comes from the EU institutions. It comes from our highly skilled workforce, innovative and flexible economy, competent tax base. It also comes from our time zone, English language, incomparable legal system. None of this has changed. The huge reforms to the UK flag that are currently being undertaken aren't going to be scrapped. If anything, they will become stronger still. The UK flag already has a reputation for safety and quality, and in time, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency is making it more commercially aware and customer focused. This isn't going to change. And we have begun working on a new manifesto to be launched later this year. The manifesto will set out in clear terms what policies the new government should implement, and as you might expect, it will be unashamedly pro-free trade and pro-free movement. But moreover, it will be ambitious. Brexit, for all the concerns and worries, provides us with an unprecedented lobbying opportunity. Governments' minds will never be more open. They will never be more willing to listen than in the next few months. What, in my view, is vital is that government should not just talk about surviving Brexit. They should now be setting out an optimistic vision of what post-Brexit UK looks like. This means making the UK the most business-friendly economy in the world. It might mean bringing forward infrastructure investment. For example, particular investment in the roads into Dover. It might mean ensuring the UK has the lowest corporation tax in the developed world. It might mean a new red tape challenge where government works with industry and our social partners to identify which European regulations should be amended, which should be removed, which ones should stay, and which ones could be used as leverage in negotiations. What is important, though, is to know that in the short term, nothing has changed. The shipping industry should do what it always has done, keep calm and carry on. Fundamentally, and for the time being, nothing has changed. There is uncertainty, yes, but the years of experience and expertise our industry has means that we do not do knee-jerk reactions. It's a mature response, but more importantly, it's the right one. So I commend the response of many of the shipping companies not to jump the gun and make the vital decisions until we have a clear political roadmap forward. The UK is a great maritime nation, and it isn't going anywhere. Business thrives on certainty, but it also thrives on opportunity and, yes, to some degree, risk. In the absence of short-term certainty, perhaps we can begin to look at what new opportunities will emerge in the long term, not least the opportunity to reclaim centre stage at the IMO and once again drive the future agenda of global shipping. Specifically on the UK's future relationship with the EU, I've seen a lot of analysis from political commentators that predict the impact on the UK in isolation, and that is just wrong. Predicting the UK's future only works if you predict the EU's future too, which has just lost its second largest member. Many polls point to rising Euroscepticism on the continent. There is pressure for countries to have their own referendums. The Eurozone crisis continues, and unpopular measures currently being proposed, such as a financial transaction tax, could create instability and uncertainty. Tensions between those who want further integration and those who don't continue. Whatever happens, the UK will continue to be a major trading partner of the EU because of political realities. German business leaders and car manufacturers have already demanded a positive deal between the EU and the UK. Exporters across the continent will be doing the same. European leaders, many of whom have forthcoming general elections, are not going to go to their electorates on a promise of punitive anti-UK measures that will harm their own national economies as well as ours. So a positive deal is possible if we put our chess pieces in place through a new Free Trade Commission, have strong political leadership once a new Prime Minister is in post, a commitment to making the UK the most business-friendly place in the world, then these measures, combined with the pan-European political realities, show that a positive future for the British trade and the shipping companies that facilitate such trade is entirely possible. I'm now really interested to hear what Scott and Harry have to say, and so back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Guy. Great presentation. Now we will hear from Scott Farley from the IUA, who will explain in more detail the risks and opportunities of Brexit on UK marine insurers. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Helen. IUA members have reacted with concern to the result of the referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. But it's clear that companies are well prepared to respond to a new business environment and adapt their business plans as necessary. There will now be an extended period of negotiation to determine the exact terms upon which the UK exits the EU, and the role of financial services must play a key part in any discussions. Uncertainty arising from the prolonged nature of this process presents challenges for the London market. Firms may have to obtain trading licences in order to continue conducting business in certain countries. This can be a lengthy process, and so prudent examination is being applied to all potential scenarios. Companies are considering both what they need to do now and how they might respond to the negotiation. It is in the interests of all industry participants that uncertainty and disruption is kept to a minimum by an early confirmation of future trading terms, with proposals set out as soon as possible. Prior to the referendum, the IUA surveyed its members for their views about UK membership of the EU. The results illustrated how it provides insurers with substantial benefits that are greatly valued. The EU Financial Services Passport allows firms based in London to conduct business across all member states and establish branch offices for a single regulator in the UK. Such open access to European markets is vital for both companies headquartered in the UK and those based in other international financial centres using London as their centre for European operations. Without passporting rights, firms may be obliged to maintain expensive capital holdings in each of the EU member states in which they operate. Preserving this advantage, therefore, must be a top priority in the exit negotiations. The free trade benefits of EU membership have been extremely important in maintaining London's position as a hub for global insurance and indeed financial services more generally. Another crucial factor in the new trading relationship will be a need to maintain some form of regulatory equivalence between the UK and remaining members of the EU. Rules governing the conduct of insurance business in the UK have been established in the context of EU membership. The UK was instrumental in developing Solvency II, which is an evolution of its own predecessor system. The RUA's own research shows that more than 20% of our members' premium income comes from continental European markets. Insurance is almost by definition an international business, and in order for it to operate efficiently, regulatory developments are pursued at an international level. Outside the EU, it will still be desirable for UK supervisors to have reciprocal arrangements in place with other national regulators. Otherwise, we will see a duplication of compliance costs that will damage companies and escalate costs for clients. In recent years, the RUA has spent much time working with other industry representatives to build consensus and enable the London market to speak powerfully with a unified voice. Increased collaboration has allowed us to represent the interests of member companies much more effectively. With the result of the referendum on the UK's membership of the EU, the ability of our industry to act in a united manner, articulate its position, and influence international developments will be more important than ever. It is essential that we engage fully to ensure that as many as possible of the trading benefits the London market currently enjoys are retained. The RUA is therefore working with other insurance and wider financial services organisations to liaise with the government and discuss the potential terms of the UK's exit from the EU. Our legal and regulatory committee, made up of senior legal counsel and compliance officers from across member companies, is currently drawing up a detailed list of issues to be considered. We look forward to seeing that. Now back over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Scott. Next up is Harry Theochari from Norton Rose Fulbright, who will talk us through the key issues for banks and ship finance. Just a quick reminder before I hand over to Harry to send your questions in via the online screen. Harry.
Helen, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to start by looking at the legal position of a Brexit. What I can tell you right now is, other than a popular vote, nothing's actually really happened. The UK is still very much part of the EU, and all the laws that were derived from EU regulations and promulgated into English law all remain in full force and effect. I mean, the fact is that actually nothing can happen until notice is given under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. Now, this notice is actually served by the UK on the European Council. And if you believe David Cameron, this isn't going to happen until at least early September and probably October. Now, the serving of this notice kicks off a period of up to 2 years. Now, during this period of 2 years, the UK and the European Council have to sit down and try to negotiate an agreement setting out the terms upon which the United Kingdom are going to exit the EU. But even that isn't the end of the story. Even once an agreement's been reached, they're still going to need the approval of the Council of Ministers. Now, this has to be done by a weighted majority, and that weighted majority is done by reference to the population of the member states. If the Council of Ministers approves it, then it has to go to the European Parliament, and then they have to pass that by a majority vote. And then finally or simultaneously, the UK Parliament has to pass this. Now, when you think back, I'm sure many of you will remember that something like 70% of the MPs in the United Kingdom were for the stay side of the campaign. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, there could be some interesting developments in all of this time, but still there is a long way to go before we see any real legal change. Now, the next question that I've been asked to look at is the impact of a Brexit on UK and EU shipping companies. From my perspective, I just don't see anything that's going to impede rights for UK shipping companies or indeed EU shipping companies to trade to the ports of either the EU in the case of British shipping companies or to the United Kingdom in the case of EU shipping companies. The big issue, first of all, is going to be what taxes, duties of tariffs might be payable, because this trade is no longer going to be within EU borders. Looking at it from a global perspective, again, I really don't see any impact on UK trade with non-EU countries. I'm sure there's going to be a myriad of new trade negotiations and agreements. I have little doubt there are probably already whispers with the US and with Commonwealth countries. And China has made no secret of the fact that they're very prepared to talk to the United Kingdom following a Brexit to look at some serious trade negotiations. I think one right that will probably disappear is that which companies incorporated in European Economic Area countries have at the moment. Now, the European Economic Area includes all the EU members, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And at the moment, those corporates do have the right to register ships on the British registry and fly their ensign. Now, bearing in mind some of the noise that has been made by the Leave campaign, I very much doubt that will be there in the future. So look, jumping ahead to regulation, a lot of people have been very concerned about what impact Brexit will have on shipping regulations. Those of you who've been involved in the industry for a number of years, you'll all be aware that the important regulations that govern our industry are all set out in international conventions, and a Brexit is not going to affect any of these. If we look at SOLAS, for example, which governs safety at sea, MARPOL, which deals with environmental issues, these are all international conventions that have a global application, and they're driven by the International Maritime Organization, not the EU. What I would say, however, is that EU companies, and indeed ships flying any flag with owners incorporated in any jurisdiction, are going to have to comply with EU regulations that are implemented by the EU. I think a good example of this are going to be the regulations relating to carbon dioxide emissions, which were put in place by the EU last year. One thing that worries me a little, talking as an asset finance lawyer based in London, is the possibility that some shipping banks and finance institutions that are very good clients of my firm and other professional services in the United Kingdom and London may choose to move to other financial centres in the EU. Look, my hope is that London's preeminent position as a maritime services cluster will convince them that this is not the right thing to do. I was very heartened by a recent PwC report that was prepared for the City of London that reconfirmed that the United Kingdom's and certainly the City of London's maritime services cluster was still the best in the world. I think what we mustn't forget is that the United Kingdom and London in particular has a centuries-old tradition in shipbroking, dare I say it, in shipping law, in accounting, and we certainly have the best marine insurance business, I think, in the world. And that, I hope, will convince many of these people who have concerns about passporting rights. These are the rights for them to provide cross-border financial services should the United Kingdom no longer be in the EU. I think we've also got to look at some intangible issues. Speaking personally, I'm an immigrant. I choose to live in this country. And what I can tell you from personal experience is that this is a great place to live. It's a great place to work. It's a wonderful place to make a home and bring up a family. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. People that work for these big finance institutions are well aware of this, and I'm sure they'll make their views known. The last point that I've been asked to cover by Helen today are what possible opportunities there may be if the United Kingdom is outside of the EU. Look, I've already touched on the potential for new trade agreements. and I'm sure there'll be some interesting negotiations with some very powerful trading partners, and it may well be that the United Kingdom can negotiate some very, very strong trade agreements that benefit the country. I think there's also the possibility that once the United Kingdom has left the EU, it won't be caught by the constraints of EU state aid restrictions. So two immediate examples come to mind. The first one is the UK could make its tonnage tax regime a lot more attractive. This will certainly attract ship owners back to the United Kingdom, and they certainly bring a lot of wealth to this country. There's also the possibility for the Exchequer to introduce more flexible incentives to invest in shipping. This can be by way of tax incentives, for example. But look, all said and done, and this is just a personal view, I think there are more issues and opportunities that arise from a Brexit, Helen, and it's interesting times for us all. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Harry. Lots of interesting points there, which I'm sure listeners will want to know more about. So now we go to our live Q&A session where I'll put your questions to the panelists. These will be kept anonymous and can be submitted via the online tool on your screen at any time. The first question I have is for Guy Platten. Guy, the UK flag has not been able to gain ground against its Asian rivals before the Brexit. Can you please clarify your bullish outlook for the UK flag in the post-Brexit environment?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yeah, it's a good question. Firstly, interestingly, the Paris MOU list has just been published, and the UK flag has moved up from 8th place to 2nd place, which I think is a pretty impressive showing. I think reforms that are currently underway in the MCA, which have already been announced and are to be announced, will make the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency a much more customer-friendly, proactive flag, which again will help attract. And there has been some nascent signs of recovery in the UK flag over the last year, which is, of course, to be welcomed. So there's every opportunity, if you get the customer service levels coupled with a great reputation, to grow that flag. And indeed, I was speaking to one major ship owner this week, who's, and this is, bearing in mind this is post the Brexit decision, who is looking to flag quite a few ships into the UK over the coming months. So I do think there is a real opportunity here for the UK flag, regardless of in or outside of the EU.
Sure. We've actually got a follow-up question to this one, which I think will be also well placed for you, Guy. The question is, will the uncertainty around tax levels reduce ship owners' preparedness to flag in the UK?
Well, if anything, it should improve, because we already have a really competitive tonnage taxation regime. That's not looking to change. And indeed, if we're outside of the EU and outside the constrictions of EU state aid, it does give us the opportunity to look carefully at all aspects of it. But not just that, I think the Chancellor has already announced that his intention is to reduce corporation tax from 20% down to 15%, and that will have, of course, knock-on effects to tonnage tax receipts as well. And our quick calculation, it looks like reducing to 15%, a typical sort of 25,000 net ton ship, it would result in savings of about £1,800 per year for that particular ship. So, I think actually we've got a competitive tax regime now, and if we're going to make it more competitive, that's only going to be to our advantage.
Sure. The next question goes to Harry Theochari. Harry, will Brexit affect the influence of the UK when negotiating international conventions concerning maritime law?
Well, the international conventions are basically driven by the International Maritime Organization, and all of the maritime nations have representatives there, and it's in that forum that decisions are made. The EU doesn't have a direct say. The EU is empowered to pass regulations of its own which apply to EU ports, and as I said earlier, every vessel, whether it's EU flag or flies the flag of any other jurisdiction or is owned by a company incorporated in any jurisdiction, has to comply with those regulations. But all of the international conventions, as I say, are really under the control of the IMO, and then it goes to the various nations who put them into law if necessary.
Sure. I've got a question here. I think this one is probably going to be good for Guy again. Guy, how would the withdrawal of the UK affect our relationship with EMSA? Directives related to accident investigation, for example, sharing of content, etc.
It's difficult to know what the long-term relationship's going to be there, but obviously Europe is still exactly the same place geographically as it was 2 weeks ago, and so we're going to and if ships are going to sort of run and go into the different jurisdictions, of course we're going to cooperate very closely with organisations like EMSA in terms and we have our own, of course, MAIB here, which has got a marvellous reputation to get into the root of all sort of shipping accidents. So. I'm not really sure where the thrust of the question is. Others, I can only see further cooperation, particularly around safety, is always going to be there.
Sure. This is an insurance-related question, so I'll put this one to Scott Farley. Realistically, what can be agreed in 2 years, or do we go into a black hole?
Well, I think the first thing I say is that we're probably looking at a longer period than 2 years, with the 2-year deadline not taking effect till after Article 50 is invoked, and that doesn't look like happening in the immediate future. Although for insurers, I think probably one of the main problems is the length of time that an agreement might take, and really I think we would like to see some kind of certainty of the direction that the new trading relationship will take as early as possible, because for many of the RUA member companies, they're already thinking about what adjustments they need to make to their business model and their corporate structures in order to continue trading after Brexit. Now, the problem there is that if new trading licenses, for example, are needed, that can be a very lengthy process, and so insurers are considering, do they wait and see what comes out of the negotiations in the hope that there will be some kind of free market access deal, or do they get on with making other arrangements and not wait? I think in order to satisfy their customer demands, there's going to be a very strong pressure not to wait and to make other arrangements. So in some ways, the earlier, the better that this is clarified for insurance.
Yes, I appreciate that. I've got another question coming through for Guy. How will UK ports remain attractive to non-EU companies exporting to Europe following Brexit?
Well, firstly, we don't know what the outcome of the negotiations is going to be. Certainly, we at the Chamber are pushing for free trade and free movement. I think that's really important. We want to keep that access to the single market as tariff-free if possible. And, we just don't know what that's going to look like at the moment. But just interestingly, we've done a sort of little bit of work, and whilst there's a long way to go, maybe there's some opportunities here as well. We know that the EU is looking at introducing an emissions trading scheme, an ETS, for the whole of the EU. And if we were to be outside of it, perhaps that could potentially provide an opportunity for shipping. The ship owner will have to pay it visiting the EU, but only from the last non-EU port of departure. So if the last non-EU port of departure is the UK, it could potentially offer some savings to ship owners and maybe an opportunity for growing a shipping hub for the UK. So it's so early days and it's difficult to tell, and we just have to wait to see what the shape of the negotiations are going to be. But rest assured, we'll be lobbying hard to make sure that we get the best possible deal out of it.
Sure. I've got a similar question here, which I think I'll put to Harry Theochari. Harry, do you think manufacturing and therefore shipping exports from the UK will fall because of Brexit?
Well, looking at this from a legal perspective, one potential issue that a number of people have raised and are concerned about is the possibility of being taxed twice. If we do leave the European Union, goods coming into the United Kingdom could carry tariffs under the World Trade Organization rate. And then the question is, if they're incorporated into goods that are manufactured here or put together here, when they go into the EU, is there another tariff on top of those? If that is allowed to happen, it clearly will make some manufacturing uncompetitive. There's no question about that. Something I think will need to be done about that, because we do have a very big and important car industry, particularly in the northeast of England now. And I think the negotiations need to focus on this issue, because we can't allow the manufacturers of cars in this country to be at a disadvantage to their EU counterparts.
I've got a follow-up question for you, Harry. One of our listeners is asking, how will the UK still be able to contribute to discussions with the EU regarding their role in shipping governance?
Well, they won't, unfortunately. I mean, once the United Kingdom is out of Europe, it won't be able to take part in the meetings of the European Parliament or the Council of Ministers. They can certainly be diplomatic discussions, but they certainly won't be able to have the say that they've had so far. And the United Kingdom has been a very important voice in EU maritime matters since it joined.
Yes, absolutely. Guy, coming back to you again, are you aware of how much of an effect withdrawal from the EU will have on those providing cabotage services within the EU?
Again, it's very early days. So, I've got my team of policy analysts really looking into all these particular areas. So, it's uncertain what the challenge is there, and indeed what opportunities there might arise out of that. So, it's been 2 weeks since the vote, and a lot of work is being undertaken just to look into all these sort of issues.
Sure. One thing that you did talk about, Guy, was the Exchequer further incentivising UK flagging. In what way could it do so?
Well, I don't think it matters incentivising UK flagging other than make it the top quality flag and with excellent customer service as that part of it, and a competitive tonnage tax regime, which is, as you'll be aware, is completely flag blind at the moment. But clearly, if you can encourage shipping companies to move into the UK tonnage tax, there's a clear opportunity as well to get them to fly the UK flag as well.
Mm-hmm. Guy, do you think there's a possibility of a Jones Act for the UK? And if so, where do we get the seafarer skills from?
Well, I hope not. We're advocating sort of free trade and free movement of people. But it's an interesting one you say about skills. One of the things that we're advocating, and this is, it's heightened with the vote, but we were advocating that before, which is increased funding into seafarer training. We are one of the more expensive places in Europe to train officer trainees, and if we can address that, which would encourage more seafarer training here in the UK, and that will help sort of look at any skills gaps which are starting to occur. So, to me, what we need to focus on is a quality product coming out of our world-class maritime colleges, and that I think will provide lots of opportunities for young people.
Sure. Staying on hiring and employment, we've got a message from one of our listeners saying that in their business they've not seen any downturn in hiring or vacancy numbers since the referendum. Now, I appreciate it's only been a couple of weeks here, but has anybody on the panel heard of any UK-based companies making cuts to UK staffing or other knee-jerk reactions? Scott, I know you mentioned that some of your members said that they may look to leave the UK. Have you heard anything further?
No. Well, I mean, it's not necessary. Most of our members are international, or all the IUA's members are international. So were we looking at changing the legal structures that they operate under cross-border? What that would mean in practice for in numbers of employees and in different locations is less clear. So, I mean, it's quite possible that you can still have a very large staff in London doing lots of work, even though their head office might be somewhere else, which is a structure that many companies operate at the moment. So I think those are more long-term decisions, which certainly haven't heard any changes yet at all.
Yeah, sure. Harry, you also raised that as one of your concerns in your presentation. Have you heard any further information about any of your customers looking to perhaps relocate to places in Europe?
Well, it's been rather more positive today. I noticed on the news this morning that a number of big and powerful influential banks from abroad have made it clear that they intend to help London retain its preeminent position as a financial centre. Signatories include JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, various other organisations, Goldman Sachs, for example. So that actually bodes very well. I sincerely hope that will be the case. I gave some reasons why I believe that these organizations should seriously think about staying in this country, notwithstanding any issues they may have with passporting rights. And I certainly hope that the strength of our maritime cluster and as I mentioned, the centuries-old tradition will convince them that this is the right place for them to be.
Sure. This question's a little bit of an economic question, so I'll put it first to Guy, and if anybody else wants to jump in, please do so. It's how is the strength of the pound affecting shipping and maritime services companies, and is there any sign this will change in the short to medium term?
Well, perhaps Harry's better placed than the maritime services companies.
Sure.
But certainly, one or two of our ship owners are not, they've suddenly got good results, because they sort of price in dollars. So they've done quite well out of it. And I was speaking to a bank earlier this week, and some people's balance sheets are looking very healthy as a result of it all, which is worrying them because they might affect the charter rates they can charge. So at the moment, in the short term, it's a positive for lots of them.
It's a bit of a two-edged sword, Helen, because it should improve exports because it makes UK producers cheaper. But it'll make imports more expensive. So I'm not sure exactly how it will balance out. But as Guy says, at the moment, because in fact most of shipping works in dollars, it's actually been a bonus for those that are in the United Kingdom also have pound sterling earnings.
Yes. I've got a question here for Guy. Guy, you talked about strong lobbying of government by UK Maritime. How can British shipping ensure its interests are at the front of the queue in these negotiations?
I think by undertaking a lot of work to making sure we've got a clear shopping list, manifesto, if you like, of requirements in any negotiations. I mean, trade seems to be at the heart of all of this, and shipping moves trade. So therefore, I do believe we're in an unprecedented opportunity at the moment. And we're going to make sure we take as much advantage of that as possible. So it's doing a lot of homework, and that's what we're up to now, seeing what areas that we could genuinely sort of look to seek opportunities, and just to make sure we get that message out there through the Chamber and also through Maritime UK as well. So that's what we'll work very hard for in the next few months.
Harry, another legal question for you. What happens if all contract terms are being fixed with the Brexit consideration and the UK subsequently remains in the EU?
Well, it shouldn't be an issue for now because we're still very much in the EU and will remain in the EU probably for the entire 2-year period and possibly longer. It is possible for that 2-year period to be extended. So I think any contracts that have been entered into at the moment will have to fully comply with anything that the EU requires to be complied with. But to the extent that people believe that there will ultimately be a Brexit, then I think the contract needs to deal with that. There needs to be very clear and unambiguous terms that anything that the parties want to change from a contractual or commercial perspective, once a Brexit occurs, then that kicks in automatically. I don't think they should leave it for anyone to assume anything. Otherwise, it will just be the terms of the contract as drafted originally. So my advice to anyone who's looking at entering into contracts now, if they believe that there should be certain commercial terms or certain legal terms that should be different, if there is a Brexit, those should be detailed in very clear and unambiguous terms at the very outset of the transaction.
Sure. Everyone, I think we've only got time for one more question, and this one goes back to Guy. Is it the case that the UK's voice at IMO may be heightened by the removal of the requirement for internal coordination amongst EU member states on matters of shared competence, such as transport policy, for example?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the opportunities there for us, because at the moment we do have to sort of to take part in internal coordination, cooperation with the other EU member states. And that's not to say that won't still happen on a case-by-case basis, but it does give us the freedom to make a case. And actually we've got a good track record there at IMO, and people also often look to the UK to come up with pragmatic solutions to intractable problems, and I think that's one of our key strengths as a maritime nation.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Unfortunately, as I said, that's all we have time for today. Thanks again to all our panellists, Guy Platten, Scott Farley and Harry Theochari. Listeners, you can get a recording of this webinar shortly. You can also find an analysis of the discussion via our website at www.lloydslist.com. I'm Helen Kelly, Europe Editor-in-Chief. This has been a Lloyd's List webinar. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.